He sent me away like I was nothing. But he forgot one thing.
Margaret Brooks did not know she had been kicked out until she opened her own front door. Inside, strangers were packing her marriage into boxes. Her dishes, her books, her winter coat, even the blue chair where she drank coffee every morning. And standing beside the movers was her husband, Russell. Not panicked, not ashamed, just waiting for her to understand that he had already made the decision without her. The condo was gone. The money was gone. Their accounts were ruined. And Margaret, at 68 years old, was being quietly removed from the life she helped build. Then Russell looked at her and said the words that made the room go silent. "You always liked that old farmhouse in West Virginia better anyway." That was when Margaret realized the truth. He had not only destroyed their finances, he had found a way to make her disappearance sound like her own choice. So she drove back to the one place he thought had nothing left to offer: an abandoned farmhouse, a forgotten roadside diner, and a locked drawer her father had left behind. What she found there would bring a whole town back to its feet and send Russell knocking on her door with nothing left but regret. And before that locked drawer is opened, subscribe, because what Margaret discovers inside will prove Russell left behind the one thing he should have feared most. But before Margaret ever reached that forgotten roadside diner, before she found the locked drawer her father had left behind, she had to survive the afternoon. Her own husband tried to remove her from the life she helped build, and it began before she even stepped inside the condo. Margaret Brooks noticed the elevator first. It opened before she pressed the button. 2 men stepped out, carrying a mattress wrapped in plastic, and one of them avoided her eyes. That was the first warning. The second was the smell: cardboard, packing tape, dust from furniture that had not been moved in years. Margaret had just come back from visiting her older sister at the assisted living center across town. Her purse still held the visitor sticker. Her hands still smelled faintly of the lavender lotion she had rubbed into her sister's wrists. She had expected quiet when she got home, maybe the hum of the refrigerator, maybe Russell reading in the living room, pretending not to hear the phone. Instead, the condo door was half open. Inside, her home had become a workplace. Boxes lined the hallway. Lamps were unplugged. Cabinet doors hung open. A stranger stood in her kitchen, wrapping her good glasses one by one. Margaret did not step in at first. She stood at the threshold, waiting for someone to explain why her life was being handled by people who did not know her name. A moving supervisor glanced at a clipboard. "Mrs. Brooks?" That was what made her stomach tighten. Not because he recognized her, because he had been expecting her. He gave a careful smile and said they were trying to stay on schedule. Schedule, as if this were a delivery, as if the woman who lived there was just another item to be managed. Margaret walked past him slowly. On the dining table sat a stack of labels: storage, donation, auction. Her eyes stopped on the last one. Auction. That word did not belong near her mother's serving bowl. It did not belong near the quilt her aunt stitched by hand. It did not belong in the room where she had spent 30 years folding napkins before holiday dinners. Then she saw Russell near the study. He was speaking quietly into his phone. Not urgently, not like a man begging for more time, like a man confirming arrangements. When he ended the call, he looked at Margaret with the weary patience of someone who had already practiced this conversation. She asked what was happening. Russell told her there had been no choice. The condo was being surrendered. The accounts had gone too far. The investments had failed. The notices had come. And somehow, every important decision had already happened without her. Margaret looked toward the study door. That was where Russell kept the files, the passwords, the statements, the folders he always said would only worry her. For years, he had called it protection. Now it looked like a locked room she had mistaken for safety. A mover came from the bedroom holding a small wooden box against his side. Margaret's breath caught. Her father's box. She crossed the room and took it before anyone could place a label on it. Inside was the old keychain from West Virginia, the farmhouse key, the diner key, and one smaller brass key she had never paid much attention to before. Russell saw it in her hand. His face changed slightly. Not fear, not guilt, recognition. Then he said, almost gently, "You always liked that old farmhouse better anyway." Margaret understood him then. He had not only hidden the collapse, he had chosen her exit. She closed her fingers around the keys and said nothing. By sunset, she was driving toward West Virginia with 3 bags in the back seat and the wooden box beside her. Russell thought he had sent her to an empty house, but in that box was a key he had failed to question, and Margaret had no idea yet that it opened more than a door. Margaret did not turn on the radio. For the first hour, the only sound inside the car was the road under the tires and the soft rattle of her father's wooden box on the passenger seat. Every few miles, her hand moved toward it, not to open it, just to make sure it was still there. Behind her, the city lights thinned out. Ahead, the highway stretched toward West Virginia, toward a farmhouse she had not slept in since her father's funeral, and a diner she had not entered for years. But the farther Margaret drove, the more one truth settled in. Russell had not erased her all at once. He had done it slowly. A phone call would come from the bank, and he would leave the room. A letter would arrive, and he would place it under a magazine before she could read the envelope. A bill would look unfamiliar, and he would smile without looking up. "I've got it," he would say. And Margaret believed him, not because she was foolish, because, after 40 years of marriage, trust can start to sound like routine. There had been signs. A canceled trip to Virginia Beach. A credit card declined at the pharmacy. A dinner invitation Russell turned down before asking her. Each time, he had an explanation. Bad timing. Bank error. Margaret was tired. Except Margaret had not been tired. She had been managed. Quietly. Politely. So completely that even her questions had started to feel like interruptions. At a rest stop outside Charleston, she pulled beneath a flickering light and checked her phone. No message from Russell. No apology. No missed call. Only a reminder from her sister's assisted living center about next week's visiting hours. Margaret stared at it. That morning, she had sat beside her sister's bed, rubbing lavender lotion into fragile hands and promising to return soon. And while she was there, movers were already inside her home, sorting her life into categories. Storage, donation, auction. She set the phone down and opened the wooden box. The old keys lay on top, tangled around a faded leather tag stamped with her father's initials. Beneath them was a photograph. Margaret at 12 years old, standing outside the diner in a yellow sweater. Her father stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder. Behind them, the red sign read, Brooks Family Diner. She had forgotten how bright the sign used to be. She had forgotten the gravel lot full of trucks before sunrise. She had forgotten how her father always smelled like coffee, flour, and wood smoke in winter. But what made her chest tighten was not the building. It was her father's face. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at her. Proud. Certain. As if he had seen something in Margaret long before she forgot how to see it in herself. She placed the photo back carefully. Then she drove on. The highway narrowed into dark mountain roads. Trees crowded both sides. Old mailboxes leaned near gravel driveways. A church sign flashed in her headlights and disappeared behind her. Just after midnight, Margaret reached the property line. The farmhouse sat beyond the fence, quiet and weathered. And beside it, almost swallowed by weeds, stood the diner Russell thought had nothing left to give. Margaret slowed the car. Then her headlights touched the front entrance. The diner door was open. Not wide, just enough to show a thin black gap where the lock should have held. Margaret sat frozen behind the wheel, because someone had been there before her. Margaret kept both hands on the steering wheel. The engine was still running. The headlights stayed fixed on the diner door, and that thin black gap where darkness showed through. For a moment, she did not move. She was 68 years old, alone on an old country road, with 3 bags in the back seat, and no one expecting her anywhere until morning. Every sensible part of her said to drive to town, find a motel, call the sheriff. But then the wind pushed against the diner door, and it moved slightly on its hinges. Not enough to open, just enough to make the old bell above it tremble. A soft sound carried through the night. Not a full ring. A memory of one. Margaret turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt bigger than the dark. She took her father's keychain from the wooden box and stepped out of the car. Gravel shifted under her shoes. The air smelled of damp grass, old wood, and rain that had not yet fallen. The farmhouse stood to her left, quiet behind overgrown shrubs. but her eyes stayed on the diner. The sign was still there above the entrance, faded almost gray. Brooks Family Diner. The red paint was gone in patches. One corner of the sign had come loose. Vines had climbed the post where truckers once tied handwritten notes during winter storms. Margaret walked closer, slowly. The front door was not broken. That was the first strange thing. The glass was intact. The frame was scratched, but not forced open. Even the lock looked whole. She touched the handle, cold, loose, as if someone had opened it carefully, then left in a hurry. Margaret swallowed and pushed the door with 2 fingers. This time, the bell rang. Clear, small, painfully familiar. The sound traveled through the empty diner and came back to her from every wall. For a second, she was 12 again, sitting in the corner booth with homework spread beside a plate of fries, watching her father pour coffee for men with tired eyes and muddy boots, hearing her mother call orders through the kitchen window like music. Then the memory vanished. The present returned. Dusty booths, a counter dulled by years, red stools with cracked seats, an old pie case, empty except for a dead moth lying in one corner. Margaret stepped inside. The air was stale, but not rotten. Someone had been here recently enough to disturb the dust near the entrance. A narrow trail led from the door toward the back counter. She followed it with her eyes. 1 set of footprints, maybe 2. Not large enough to be work boots, not fresh enough to have been made that night. Margaret reached for the wall switch. Nothing happened. Of course, she used her phone flashlight instead. The beam moved across old menus, a coffee machine with a cracked pot, salt shakers lined up like no one ever told them the diner had closed. Then the light caught something on the counter. An envelope, yellowed with age, but not covered in dust. Margaret stepped closer. Her name was written on it. Not Mrs. Brooks. Not Margaret and Russell. Just Margaret. The handwriting made her breath stop. It was her father's. She stared at the envelope for a long moment, unable to touch it. Because her father had been dead for 15 years, and yet someone had left his letter where she would find it. Margaret did not open the envelope right away. She stood behind the counter with her phone light trembling in her hand, staring at her name in her father's handwriting. 15 years. That was how long he had been gone. 15 years since she stood beside his grave in a black coat, listening to neighbors say he was a good man, a quiet man, a stubborn man. But no one had ever told her he left a letter inside the diner. Margaret set the envelope on the counter and looked toward the back kitchen. The trail in the dust did not stop at the counter. It continued past the register, toward the swinging door. That was when she understood something. Whoever had been inside the diner had not come for shelter. They had been looking for something. Margaret took the smaller brass key from her father's keychain and walked into the kitchen. The smell changed immediately. Old grease, cold metal, dry wood. The kitchen looked frozen in time. Pans hung from rusted hooks. A flour bin sat under the prep table. The big stove stood against the wall like an animal asleep in the dark. And, near the pantry, beneath the narrow window, was the locked drawer. Her father never let anyone touch. Margaret remembered it now. As a child, she had once tried to open it while waiting for pie crust to cool. Her father had caught her hand and smiled. Some things are not ready for children. Back then, she thought he meant money, or receipts, or grown-up business. Now, standing there at 68, with her marriage packed into boxes miles behind her, she wondered if he had meant something else. The brass key fit. The drawer resisted at first. Then it opened with a dry wooden scrape. Inside were 3 thick notebooks tied with string. No treasure, no cash, no legal papers, just recipe books. Margaret almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything Russell had taken, part of her had foolishly hoped the drawer might hold some answer large enough to save her. But then she untied the first notebook. Her father's handwriting filled every page. Biscuit, chicken pot pie, beef stew, apple butter, cornbread, blackberry cobbler. At first, it was exactly what it seemed to be. A diner's memory written in measurements. Then Margaret noticed the margins. Beside the stew recipe, her father had written, Miller family, no charge. Flood took basement. Beside the biscuits, Helen came again. Husband laid off. Send extra home. Beside the apple pie, Sam drives overnight. Save last slice. Says it keeps him awake. Margaret stopped turning pages. The kitchen felt smaller. Not frightening. Heavy. As if the walls had been holding their breath for years. She opened the second notebook. There were more names. More dates. More quiet notes. Meals forgiven. Coffee given free. Children fed before school. Truckers allowed to sleep in their cabs out back when the mountain roads iced over. Her father had not only written recipes, he had kept a record of people he refused to let go hungry. Margaret touched one page with 2 fingers. All her life she had thought the diner closed because business slowed down, because the road changed, because her father grew tired. But these books told a different story. The diner had been carrying people, maybe for years, maybe at a cost no one saw. She remembered him coming home late, smelling of coffee and smoke. She remembered him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, rubbing his thumb over a stack of unpaid invoices. Back then, she thought he was distant. Now she wondered if he had simply been exhausted from kindness. Margaret returned to the front counter and opened the envelope. Inside was one sheet of paper, only a few lines. Margaret, if you are reading this, then the diner has called you back before you were ready. Don't trust the first story people tell you about why it closed. Start with the books. Then ask Ruth Callahan what happened that winter. Margaret read the last line twice. Ruth Callahan. She had not heard that name in years. Then, from somewhere outside the diner, a porch light flickered on across the road, and an old woman's silhouette appeared behind the curtain, watching Margaret through the dark. Margaret did not sleep much that night. She locked the diner door from the inside, checked it twice, then crossed the yard to the farmhouse with her father's letter folded inside her coat pocket. Across the road, Ruth Callahan's porch light stayed on. For nearly 20 minutes, Margaret could see the old woman's shape behind the curtain, watching, waiting, as if she had known this night would come long before Margaret did. The farmhouse greeted her with cold air and old silence. Sheets covered the furniture. Dust softened the edges of every table and chair. In the kitchen, the clock above the stove had stopped at 4:17, though Margaret had no idea whether it died in the morning or the afternoon. She placed the wooden box on the table, then the recipe books, then the letter. 3 pieces of a life she thought she understood, and suddenly did not. Ruth Callahan. What happened that winter? Those words followed her even after she lay down on the narrow bed in her childhood room. She closed her eyes, but sleep came in broken pieces. Russell's voice, packing tape, her father's handwriting, the diner bell. By sunrise, Margaret stopped pretending rest was coming. She washed her face in cold water, tied her hair back, and walked to the diner with the first notebook pressed against her chest. She did not plan to cook for anyone. Not Ruth, not the town, not some memory she had not asked to carry. She only wanted one meal, something warm, something steady, something that belonged to her before the phone calls, the debts, the boxes, and Russell's calm face. She chose the simplest recipe, chicken stew. The kitchen fought her at first. The faucet coughed brown water before clearing. One burner clicked 3 times before catching. A cabinet door nearly came loose in her hand. The old pot had to be scrubbed for 10 minutes before she trusted it. But slowly, the room changed. Onions softened in butter. Pepper lifted into the air. Chicken broth warmed the cold metal walls. For the first time since she left the condo, Margaret breathed without feeling watched. She followed her father's measurements exactly until she reached a note in the margin. Add more carrots if the day has been hard. Margaret stared at it. Then she added 2 extra handfuls. When the stew was ready, she sat alone at the counter with a chipped bowl and a spoon that did not match. The first taste nearly broke her, not because it was perfect, because it was familiar. Not the kind of familiar that traps you in the past, the kind that reaches through the dark and reminds you that you once had roots. Margaret lowered the spoon. Outside, gravel shifted. She looked toward the window. Ruth Callahan stood by the diner, steps in a brown sweater, one hand resting on the railing, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from Margaret's bowl. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Ruth knocked once on the glass. Not hard, not polite either, like someone asking to be let back into a story that had never really ended. Ruth Callahan did not ask if she could come in. She waited at the glass with one hand on the railing, wrapped in that brown sweater, looking thinner than Margaret remembered, but not fragile. Never fragile. Margaret unlocked the door. The bell rang above them. Ruth stepped inside and stopped just past the entrance, as if crossing that threshold required permission from the past. Her eyes moved over the counter. The red stools, the empty pie case, the old coffee machine. Then she looked at the bowl in Margaret's hand. "Your father's chicken stew?" Margaret nodded. Ruth's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Margaret to see that the smell had reached somewhere words could not. Margaret found another bowl and ladled stew into it. Ruth sat at the counter, both hands around the bowl, waiting until the steam softened her glasses. Then she tasted it. Her eyes closed. For several seconds, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. People used to come here when they had nowhere else to go. Margaret stayed behind the counter, still holding the ladle. She wanted to ask about the letter, about Winter, about why her father had written Ruth's name like an instruction. But something in Ruth's face told her not to rush. So Margaret waited. Ruth took another spoonful. Then she pointed toward the far booth by the window. "Your daddy kept that one empty during storms," she said. "Not for customers, for anyone who got stranded." Margaret looked at the booth. The vinyl seat was cracked now. Dust sat in the corners. One side leaned slightly where the frame had weakened. She had sat there as a child, coloring menus while her father worked. She never knew it had belonged to people who needed shelter. Ruth continued. "There was a miner who slept there 3 nights after the bridge washed out. A young mother with 2 babies once stayed until morning. Truckers too tired to drive the mountain road. Your father would give them coffee and tell them the register was closed." Margaret lowered the ladle. "The register was closed?" Ruth gave a faint smile. That was his way of saying nobody owed him. The words settled heavily in the room. Margaret thought of the notebooks, the names, the unpaid meals, the quiet records written beside recipes. Her father had carried more than food in this place. He had carried shame for people who could not carry it themselves. Ruth finished half the bowl before she looked up again. "Why did you come back, Margaret?" The question was simple, but it touched the bruise. Margaret looked toward the window, where the farmhouse stood across the yard. "Russell lost almost everything," she said. "Then he made it sound like this place was where I belonged." Ruth's expression hardened, not with surprise, with recognition. Men like that always call it kindness when they are done making decisions. Margaret almost smiled. Almost. Then Ruth leaned closer. "You know your father refused to sell this place twice?" Margaret turned. "No. First time was after the highway changed. Second time was that winter." There it was again. That winter. The words from the letter rose between them. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the paper. Ruth saw the handwriting before Margaret said anything. Her face went pale. Slowly, she set the spoon down. "Where did you find that?" "In the diner," Margaret said. "He said to ask you what happened." Ruth stared at the letter as if it had reopened a door she had spent years holding shut. Outside, a truck passed on the road, its tires hissing over damp pavement. Inside, neither woman moved. At last, Ruth whispered, "Then he knew you would come back." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. "What winter, Ruth?" The old woman looked toward the back kitchen, toward the locked drawer, toward the notebooks on the counter. Then she said something Margaret was not ready for. "The winter, this town almost let your father lose everything, because he chose to feed people who could not pay." Margaret's hand tightened around the letter. Ruth pushed the bowl away, stood slowly, and looked toward the front windows. "If you want the truth," she said, "you need more than my memory." She pointed across the road to her little white house. "I kept the names." Ruth's house smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Not dust, not neglect. Everything had been kept with the careful order of someone who knew memory could be lost if no one protected it. Margaret sat at the small kitchen table while Ruth moved slowly toward a narrow cabinet beside the stove. Outside, morning had fully reached the road. Sunlight touched the diner windows across the street, revealing streaks in the glass and weeds near the steps. From Ruth's kitchen, the place looked smaller, more vulnerable, like it could disappear before lunch if the wrong person signed the right paper. Ruth unlocked the cabinet and brought out a metal cookie tin. The lid was faded blue, with painted snowflakes around the edge. She placed it in front of Margaret. "This is what your father asked me to keep," Ruth said. Margaret looked up. "He asked you?" Ruth nodded once. After that winter, she opened the tin. Inside were folded index cards, receipts, handwritten notes, and small scraps of paper with names written across them. Not just names, families, dates, amounts. Some had check marks beside them. Some had the word paid. Others had no mark at all. Margaret lifted one card carefully. Dawson family. 4 meals, no charge. Furnace out. Another. Ray Bell. Coffee and stew. Road closed. Another. Martha Lane and children. Send bread home. The cards were not dramatic. That made them hurt more. They were ordinary records of people trying to survive. Ruth sat across from her. That winter, the mill cut shifts. Then the flood came early. Roads washed out. Men lost work. Families were cold. Your father kept feeding them. Margaret swallowed. And people didn't pay? Some couldn't, Ruth said. Some did later. Some never got the chance. Margaret looked through the cards again. There were too many. Far too many. Then Ruth pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. The headline was yellowed, but still readable. Local diner owner refuses land offer as highway project expands. Margaret read it twice. Ruth tapped the clipping. A company wanted this stretch of road. Not just his land. Mine too. A few others. Your father refused first. Why? Because the offer came with a condition. Margaret looked at her. Ruth's face tightened. They wanted the diner closed before winter ended, said it was in the way of future development. The room became quiet. Margaret thought of the recipe books, the notes in the margins. The booth kept open during storms. If the diner had closed then, people would have lost more than coffee and stew. They would have lost the only warm room that did not ask questions. Ruth reached into the tin again and pulled out a newer envelope. White. Clean. Too modern to belong with the rest. Margaret's name was typed across the front. This came last month, Ruth said. Margaret did not move. To you? To the property, Ruth said. I watched the mailbox after your father died. Too many people forgot that land still had a story attached to it. Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was an offer from a development company. The amount was larger than she expected. Large enough to solve problems. Large enough to tempt a woman who had just been pushed out with 3 bags and no clear future. But the second page made her stomach tighten. The buyer wanted full control of the farmhouse, the diner, and the surrounding land. Demolition permitted after closing. Demolition. Margaret saw the word and looked through Ruth's window at the diner. The faded sign. The cracked steps. The doorbell that still rang. Ruth's voice softened. That money would make sense to almost anyone. Margaret did not answer, because part of her knew Ruth was right. Then her phone buzzed. For 1 second, she thought it might be Russell. It was worse. A voicemail notification from an unknown number. Margaret pressed play. A woman's polished voice filled the kitchen. Mrs. Brooks, this is Karen Whitlock with Ridgeway Development. We understand there may be new urgency regarding the property. We would like to discuss an immediate purchase before other claims complicate the process. The message ended. Margaret sat very still. Ruth's eyes narrowed. New urgency? Margaret looked back at the diner. Someone knew she was here. Someone knew about Russell. And someone wanted the property before she understood why. By late afternoon, Margaret had 3 things spread across the diner counter. Her father's recipe books, Ruth Callahan's tin of names, and the development company's offer. The money sat there in black ink. Clean, easy, almost kind. Enough to pay for a lawyer. Enough to cover months of fear. Enough to let Margaret stop pretending she knew what tomorrow required. But across the counter, the old notebooks told another story. They were stained with flour, soft at the corners, crowded with names of people who had once walked through that door cold, hungry, ashamed, and left with something warm in their hands. Margaret looked from one pile of paper to the other. One offered escape, the other asked her to stay. Outside, clouds gathered over the mountain road. The diner windows turned gray. Wind pressed against the old sign until it creaked above the entrance. Then the county inspector arrived. He was younger than Margaret expected. Polite, careful, not cruel. That almost made it worse. He walked through the diner with a clipboard, checking outlets, ceiling tiles, plumbing, storage shelves, the back door, the old stove, and the floor near the dish sink. Margaret followed him quietly. Each time he paused, her heart tightened. The wiring needed review. The water heater was outdated. The back steps had to be repaired. The kitchen needed proper certification before any public serving. The fire suppression system had to be inspected. And the restroom, he said gently, would not pass in its current condition. By the time he finished, the list filled 2 pages. He gave it to Margaret with an apologetic look. "I'm not saying it can't be done," he said, "but it's a lot to take on." Then his eyes moved toward the faded booths, the cracked stools, the dusty pie case. "For someone starting over," he added. He did not say her age. He did not need to. After he left, the diner felt colder. Margaret sat at the counter with the repair list beside the developer's offer. The choice looked almost insulting. Fight a building that needed money she did not have, or sign one paper and let it all become someone else's problem. Her phone buzzed. This time, the name on the screen made her hand go still. Russell. She watched it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. She did not answer. When it stopped, the silence seemed to lean closer. A voicemail appeared. Margaret stared at it for nearly a minute before pressing play. Russell's voice came through thin and careful. "Margaret, I heard you reached West Virginia. We should talk before you make any decisions about the property. There are things you may not understand." The message ended. No apology. No concern. Only a warning dressed as advice. Margaret set the phone face down. For the first time that day, anger rose in her. Not loud, not wild. Something quieter, sharper. Russell had packed her life into boxes, handed her an old address like charity, and now he wanted a voice in what remained. Rain started outside. A hard rain. It struck the roof, ran down the windows, and blurred the road beyond the glass. Margaret gathered the papers to keep them from the leak dripping near the counter. As she moved the recipe books, one of them slipped from her hand and fell open on the floor. A folded note slid out. She bent slowly and picked it up. The paper was old, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. Only one line filled the page. "Margaret notices what others miss. One day, that will save this place." She read it once, then again. The rain kept beating the roof. The offer waited on the counter. The repair list waited beside it. Russell's voice still seemed to hang in the room, but Margaret was no longer looking at any of them. She was looking at the tin of names Ruth had kept. People her father fed when the town was breaking. People who had owed him nothing but remembered everything. Margaret stood. She took a clean sheet from the old register drawer and wrote one sentence across the top. "Community supper for Brooks Family Diner Repairs. Saturday evening. Pay what you can." Her hand shook when she taped it inside the front window, but she did not take it down. Across the road, Ruth's porch light came on. Then another light flickered in the house beside it. Then one more, farther down the road. Margaret stepped back from the window. For the first time since she returned, the diner did not feel abandoned. It felt watched over, and just before she turned off her phone for the night, a text came through from an unknown number. "Mrs. Brooks, selling may be safer than reopening old debts." Margaret stared at the message, because whoever sent it knew about the debts her father had never collected. By Saturday afternoon, the old diner smelled alive again. Not perfect, not polished, alive. Chicken stew simmered on the stove, biscuits warmed in the oven. Coffee moved through the old machine in slow, uneven drips, filling the room with a smell Margaret had not realized she missed until it returned. Ruth stood near the pie case, wiping glass that still held scratches from another lifetime. Elaine Mercer, the former waitress Ruth had called in, tied a faded apron around her waist like she had been waiting years to do it again. She was in her 70s now. Silver hair, sharp eyes, steady hands. She looked around the room once and nodded toward the counter. "Your father kept the extra napkins under there," she said. Margaret opened the cabinet. The napkins were still there, wrapped in old paper. Elaine did not smile. She only whispered, "Of course he did." By 5 o'clock, Margaret's sign in the window had begun to feel foolish. "Community supper for Brooks Family Diner Repairs. Saturday evening. Pay what you can." The words looked too hopeful, too exposed. What if nobody came? What if the town remembered the diner with fondness, but not enough to step inside? What if Russell was right, and this place was only useful as something to leave behind. Then headlights appeared on the road. One car, then another, then a pickup truck with a dented tailgate. A woman stepped out, carrying a tray covered in foil. A retired mechanic came with a toolbox in one hand and an envelope in the other. Two teenagers arrived with their grandmother, who touched the diner door before entering. As if greeting someone, the bell rang, then rang again, then kept ringing. Margaret stood behind the counter, one hand resting near the register that was not really being used. People came in slowly at first, careful with their voices. Then the room warmed. Chairs scraped. Coffee cups clinked. Someone laughed near the back booth. A man in a trucker cap looked at the chalkboard menu and said he had not seen chicken stew written there since he was 26. Another woman brought a photograph of her father standing beside Margaret's father after a snowstorm. A young mother paid $5 for 3 bowls and tried to apologize. Margaret shook her head. "Pay what you can," she said. The woman's eyes filled before she turned away. That was when Margaret understood why her father had written everything down. Not to keep score. To remember that dignity mattered most when people had the least. Halfway through the evening, Elaine placed a small cardboard box beside the register. People began dropping folded bills into it. Some added checks. Some added notes. One note said, "For the booth where my mother stayed warm in 1983. Another said, "Your father fed my uncle when he was too proud to ask." Margaret read them only when she had a moment alone, and each one made the room feel larger, not bigger in size, bigger in meaning. Outside, the rain from the night before had left the gravel soft. Trucks parked along the shoulder like they used to. The diner windows glowed against the dark road, and for the first time in years, Brooks' family diner looked less like a closed place, and more like a promise being kept. Then, someone posted a video. Margaret did not know it at first. A teenager near the front booth filmed the old bell ringing, the full counter, Ruth pouring coffee, Elaine calling out orders, and Margaret ladling stew into chipped bowls. By 8 o'clock, people from neighboring roads had started arriving. By 9, the stew was almost gone. By 9:30, the donation box had enough inside to cover the first inspection repairs. Margaret should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something quieter. Responsibility. Because if people were willing to come back this fast, then the diner had not only belonged to her father, it still belonged to them. Near closing, Ruth touched Margaret's arm and nodded toward the window. A black sedan had pulled into the gravel lot. It was too clean for the road, too unfamiliar for the town. A woman stepped out wearing a dark coat and heels that sank slightly into the wet ground. Karen Whitlock, the development company. Margaret recognized the voice before the woman even reached the door. The bell rang. The room quieted almost at once. Karen looked around at the full booths, the donation box, the handwritten notes, the old photographs gathering near the register. Then she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. "Mrs. Brooks," she said softly, "this is exactly why we need to talk." Margaret felt every person in the diner turn toward her, and for the first time, she understood. The threat was no longer waiting outside. It had walked in through the front door. Karen Whitlock stood inside Brooks' family diner as if she already owned the place. Her coat was dry, her shoes were expensive, her smile was careful. But the room around her did not belong to careful people. It belonged to Ruth Callahan, who had kept names in a cookie tin for decades. It belonged to Elaine Mercer, who still remembered where Margaret's father kept the napkins. It belonged to the truckers, widows, retired mill workers, church ladies, young mothers, and tired families who had walked through those doors when life had become too heavy. And now, it belonged to Margaret, too. Karen looked at the donation box near the register, then at the handwritten notes, then at the old photographs people had pinned along the wall. "This is touching," she said. Not cruelly. Worse, politely, as if emotion was something people used when they did not understand money. Margaret stepped out from behind the counter. The room stayed quiet. Karen lowered her voice. "Mrs. Brooks, I know this evening feels meaningful, but you need to think clearly. This building needs repairs. The property has unpaid complications, and your husband's financial situation may create claims you are not prepared for." Margaret felt the words move through the room. Your husband, financial situation, claims. That was how people like Karen wrapped fear in clean language. Then Karen placed a folder on the counter. Our offer still stands, but not forever. No one spoke. Margaret looked down at the folder. For a moment, she saw what Russell had wanted her to see. An old building, an impossible repair list, a woman starting over too late. But then she looked beyond Karen, at Ruth's hands folded on the counter, at Elaine standing near the coffee pot, at the young mother holding her child close in the far booth, at the notes beside the donation box, and Margaret understood something her father must have learned long before her. A place does not become valuable because someone offers money for it. A place becomes valuable when people are afraid to lose what it gave them. Margaret pushed the folder back. "Not tonight," she said. Karen's smile thinned. Before she could answer, headlights swept across the diner windows. A car pulled into the gravel lot. The engine shut off. The door opened, and Russell Brooks stepped into the light from the diner sign. For 1 second, Margaret forgot the room around her. He looked smaller than he had 3 days before. His coat was wrinkled. His face looked tired. The confidence he had worn in the condo hallway was gone, replaced by something anxious and searching. He paused when he saw the crowd. Then he saw Karen, and Margaret saw the truth pass between them. Not friendship, not surprise, recognition. Ruth noticed it too. Elaine's eyes narrowed. Russell came inside slowly. The bell rang above him. It was the same sound Margaret had heard when she first returned. But this time, it did not sound like a memory. It sounded like a warning. "Margaret," Russell said. Her name came out carefully, like he was testing whether it still belonged to him. She did not move toward him. Karen reached for her folder. "I think this is a family matter," she said. Margaret looked at her. "No. It stopped being a family matter when strangers knew more about my property than I did." The diner went still. Russell swallowed. Karen's face cooled. Margaret turned back to him. "Did you contact them?" Russell looked toward the windows. That was answer enough. He began softly, the way he always did when he wanted his choices to sound reasonable. "I made inquiries before things got worse. I thought if the property had value, we needed to understand our options." Margaret almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because even now, he said after selling assets without her, after hiding notices, after sending movers into her home, after calling exile a preference. "You sent me here," she said. "Then you tried to sell the place before I knew what it was." Russell's face tightened. "That is not fair." Margaret nodded once. "No, it isn't." Those 3 words landed harder than anger. Russell looked around the diner. At the full booths, the donation box, the people watching him without shouting. Maybe that was what unsettled him most. No one had to call him a villain. They only had to see him clearly. His voice dropped. "The accounts are worse than you know. Creditors are calling. I have nothing left to work with. If you refuse this offer, you may be making a mistake both of us will pay for." There it was. The old pressure. The old fear. The old way of making his emergency her responsibility. Margaret walked behind the counter. For a moment, everyone watched her reach for a clean bowl. She filled it with the last of the chicken stew, added 2 biscuits to a plate, then placed both in front of Russell. He stared at the food as if he did not understand it. Margaret's voice stayed calm. "My father fed people who had nowhere to go," she said. "I won't stop being his daughter because you forgot how to be decent." Russell's eyes lifted. Something broke in his expression. Shame, maybe. Or hunger. Or the first honest understanding of what he had thrown away. Margaret continued. "You can eat, then you can leave. Anything legal goes through my attorney." Karen shifted. "Mrs. Brooks, you may want to reconsider before making emotional decisions." Margaret turned to her. "This is not emotional." Then she looked around the diner. At the people, at the walls, at the old sign reflected in the window. "This is informed." Ruth smiled first. Small, proud. Then Elaine picked up the developer's folder from the counter and handed it back to Karen. "We're closing soon," Elaine said. A few people laughed softly. Not cruelly, just enough to let the room breathe again. Karen left without another word. Russell stayed seated. For the first time since Margaret had known him, he had nothing prepared to say. Months later, Brooks Family Diner opened legally. Not grand, not famous, not perfect, but alive. The wiring was repaired. The steps were replaced. The restroom passed inspection. The old sign was repainted red, not bright enough to erase its age, just enough to honor it. Inside, one wall held the old letters and recipe pages. Beside them were new notes. Thank you for the meal. My mother remembered this place. I brought my son so he would know. Paid extra for someone who needs it. Every Friday, Margaret kept one booth open. The far booth by the window, the one her father had saved during storms. No sign explained it. No announcement was made. But people knew. And when someone came in tired, cold, ashamed, or short on cash, Margaret would look toward that booth and say softly, "Sit wherever you're comfortable." One morning, before sunrise, she unlocked the front door. The bell rang above her. Coffee began to brew. Ruth waved from the first booth. Elaine tied her apron and complained that the biscuits were rising too slowly. Outside, trucks moved along the mountain road. Inside, Margaret stood behind the counter with her father's keychain in her pocket. She had come back with 3 bags and no clear future, but she had not come back empty. She had come back to a place that remembered her before she remembered herself. Russell had sent her there because he thought it had nothing left to give. He was wrong. It gave her a name beyond wife, a purpose beyond survival, a home beyond walls, and finally, a life no one else could pack away. If Margaret's story moved you, take a second to like this video and subscribe for more stories where forgotten people rise again. And tell me in the comments, was Margaret right to feed Russell before sending him away? Or would you have closed the door the moment he walked in? Thank you for watching.